Headlines paint a picture of a partnership in flames. President Trump, demanding a deal, unleashes crippling tariffs to bring his closest ally to heel. But in Ottawa, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, delivers a stunning response. He's ready to walk away from the table entirely. As negotiations break down and the threat of a full-blown economic schism looms, Canada is making a bold, risky pivot away from America. But what could be worth torpedoing the world's most successful trade relationship? For generations, the United States and Canada shared more than just the world's longest undefended border. They shared a destiny. Their economies were so deeply intertwined that they often functioned as one, a continental powerhouse built on a foundation of mutual trust and shared interests. This was the gold standard of international partnerships, a relationship so stable and predictable that businesses invested billions on both sides of the border without a second thought. For decades, the unwritten rule was simple: we rise or fall together. But this foundation was systematically dismantled by the ideology of America First. The Trump administration began to view this deep integration not as a strength, but as a weakness to be exploited. The promise of partnership was replaced with the threat of punishment. The first major crack appeared on February 1st, 2025, when President Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods. The move, which violated the spirit of the USMCA, was a declaration of economic war. It signaled that the old rules no longer applied. Trust was replaced with leverage, and cooperation with coercion. This wasn't just another trade dispute. It was a fundamental betrayal that would force Canada to make a bold, history-altering choice. President Trump's strategy was designed to be a knockout blow. By imposing a sweeping 25% tariff on his closest ally, later threatening to raise it to 35%, he intended to create an economic crisis so severe that Canada would have no choice but to offer immediate concessions. The justification for the tariffs was a moving target, but the goal was always the same: leverage. He was betting that Canada's heavy reliance on the US market was its Achilles heel. To amplify the pressure, the White House began injecting unrelated, highly sensitive political demands into the negotiations. In a stunning display of coercive diplomacy, Trump threatened to refuse to sign any deal unless Canada withheld its planned recognition of a Palestinian state. This move transformed the conflict from a trade dispute into a direct assault on Canada's sovereignty and its right to conduct its own foreign policy. The White House believed it had created the perfect trap. By combining overwhelming economic pressure with impossible political demands, it sought to force Canada into a state of chaos and desperation. The message from Washington was clear and brutal. Everything is on the table, and nothing is off limits until you give us the deal we want. This was the America First doctrine in its purest form, a belief that America's economic might gave it the right to dictate terms to any nation, including its oldest and most loyal friend. President Trump wasn't just pushing for a better deal, he was trying to fundamentally rewrite the rules of the relationship, turning a partnership of equals into one of dominance and submission. He expected a quick Canadian surrender. He was about to be profoundly mistaken. The chaos from Washington was met with a radical and history-defining response from Ottawa. In March 2025, Mark Carney, a globally respected economist and former head of the banks of England and Canada, took the helm. From his very first day, he signaled that this would not be business as usual. His initial declaration, "Canada is not for sale," wasn't just a soundbite. It was the opening salvo of a bold new national strategy. Carney and his government made a calculated decision. If the United States was no longer a reliable partner, then Canada would no longer be a dependent one. Instead of desperately trying to put the old relationship back together, Carney announced that Canada would begin a historic, long-term pivot to fundamentally rechart its own economic destiny. This was not a bluff. It was a concrete, actionable plan. Carney's government began aggressively pursuing a two-pronged strategy. First, they looked outward, launching a massive diplomatic and trade effort to diversify Canada's export markets to the European Union and the fast-growing economies of Asia. The goal was to systematically reduce the country's economic reliance on the volatile American market. Second, and more importantly, they looked inward. Carney championed a plan to break down Canada's own internal trade barriers, frustrating hurdles that sometimes made it easier for a province to trade with a U.S. state than with its neighboring province. Initiatives like the One Canadian Economy Act and billions in new domestic infrastructure spending were designed to build a more resilient, self-sufficient, and unified Canadian economy. It was a declaration of economic independence, a bold statement that Canada would no longer allow its fate to be decided by the political whims of Washington. This new strategy culminated in the ultimate act of defiance. As negotiations in Washington stalled, with the U.S. refusing to back down from its extreme demands, the Carney government made a stunning decision. According to senior advisor David Volpe, the Canadian negotiating team was given the green light to walk away from the table entirely. This wasn't a threat or a negotiating tactic. It was the logical conclusion of their new national strategy. Why continue to negotiate with a partner who refused to act in good faith? Carney had decided that a bad deal was worse than no deal at all. By walking away, Canada was sending an unmistakable message to Washington and the world. The era of Canadian dependency was over. The attempt to corner Canada had failed. Instead, it had pushed it to find its own way out of the maze. Walking away from the table was a bold act of sovereignty, but it came at a steep and immediate price for ordinary Canadians. President Trump's tariffs, while failing to break the government's will, were a blunt instrument that inflicted real damage on the ground. As trade slowed and business uncertainty mounted, companies were forced to lay off workers, and unemployment began to tick upward. Families who had nothing to do with international trade policy suddenly found their financial security threatened. The economic pain fueled a growing sense of frustration and a surge in anti-American sentiment across the country, as many Canadians felt they were being punished for their government's refusal to be bullied. The pain was particularly acute in the highly integrated manufacturing sector. For a worker at an auto parts plant in Ontario, their job had always depended on the seamless flow of goods across the border. The tariffs disrupted that flow, creating chaos and threatening the viability of their plant. The government's promise of a diversified future offered little comfort to those facing the immediate threat of a pink slip. Carney's strategy was a long-term investment in Canada's independence, but it required short-term sacrifices from the very workers and communities that form the backbone of the nation's economy. They were the ones paying the price for this newfound freedom. But this economic pain was not confined to Canada. The decision to walk away from negotiations sent a shockwave through American industries that depended on their northern neighbor. For years, American farmers had relied on Canada as a stable and lucrative market for their grain, meat, and produce. Canada's retaliatory tariffs, combined with the souring relationship, caused those sales to plummet. For a farmer in the Midwest, this wasn't an abstract geopolitical conflict. It was a direct hit to their bottom line, a loss of income that threatened their family's legacy on the land. They were caught in the crossfire of a trade war they did not ask for. The impact was also felt by ordinary American consumers and businesses. Canada is a critical supplier of everything from lumber for new homes to aluminum for cars and appliances. The tariffs and the breakdown in trade drove up the cost of these essential materials, feeding inflation and making it more expensive for Americans to build homes, buy cars, and run businesses. More profoundly, the chaos shattered the predictability that American companies had long taken for granted. The America First strategy, designed to protect U.S. interests, had instead made America a less stable and more expensive place to do business, proving that in a deeply integrated relationship, an attack on your partner is often an act of economic self-harm. A president's demand for submission, met by a prime minister's bold decision to walk away, has pushed the world's most successful partnership to the breaking point. The gambit to force Canada into a new deal has failed, triggering instead a historic pivot toward Canadian economic independence. The old foundation of trust lies in ruins, leaving two nations whose futures have been intertwined for a century to navigate a new and uncertain path alone. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.